All right, good morning, class, or afternoon, whatever time you're looking at this. Could be midnight, but for me, it is around 11 a.m. and I'm sitting poolside with my nice, tasty beverage, my Aloha shirt. Paulette said she liked the view poolside, so I went with that again. And so, anyway, we're going to be talking a little bit about second edition of Disestablishment since 1947. And then, as you know, that 1947, that was the Everson versus Board of Education case, and it had to do with school busing, whether or not they could bus parochial students to and from school. And it was found that that was not a violation of the Establishment Clause, even though in discussing it, the majority opinion, religion was not put in too favorable a light. Now, so anyway, since then, since 1947, moving forward, there were three approaches to disestablishment. One would have been separation, that is separationism. That is to completely separate religion from anything secular or public, that is, anything governmental. There was another approach, accommodationism, in which certain religious entities or individuals would be accommodated for their religious beliefs that say conflicted with certain laws or ordinances. And the reason for doing so is because it put too much of a burden on those people, and the state did not, they had a higher level of scrutiny as to whether or not they could enforce that law on individual citizens, so they practiced that. And finally, neutrality, this idea that government is neutral in all things religion versus non-religion, or religion versus other religions. And of course, as we discussed earlier in the last video, I didn't believe that the court was all that neutral. And I think you're going to find that to be the case with today's lecture too, when we discuss the cases. Later on, there were new tests for this, or formulas, and one had to do with endorsement, whether or not the government endorsed any particular religion by its action, by any laws, or even by its monetary support somehow. Was the government ever seen as putting its stamp of approval on something? I'll give you an example. So a creche in the public square, a creche is a nativity scene. Let's imagine that a local fire department decides to put up a loud group, or they themselves put up a nativity scene in celebration of the Christmas holiday. Well, it turns out that that's a government entity doing that, or the persons are private, but they work for the government. So it's perceived by others that the government is endorsing a particular religion, that of Christianity. Another approach to this, another test, would be coercion, whether or not any state action coerces people, be it students in school or employees, to act in a way that is either towards one religion or against their own religion. If the government is doing this, and we see this in prayer in schools, these cases with prayer in schools, prayer on the football field, stuff like that, where people, if somebody's being coerced into a religion, or perceived to be, or even possibly, remember, it just needs to go down that road, then that is a problem. It is endorsement. But here's the interesting thing. There are going to be later cases like Ward v. Wilbanks and Keaton. I don't remember who she's had to go to school to sue. They actually were coerced in very aggressively towards against their Christian worldviews. They were kicked out of their schools, told that if they were going to be put back in those schools, they would have to go through a remediation plan, which would have violated, and it was really obnoxious, would have violated their religious beliefs. And of course, it didn't work out that way. They were coerced, but the coercion test just didn't apply to them, because they weren't being coerced into a religion, but against their own. Finally, equal treatment, and that's going to go, you can see where that's kind of reminiscent of the neutrality principle as well. Now, Justice Black, when he issued the concurring opinion, the majority opinion in Everson. He did so where in Everson they actually got to maintain the busing, and they believed they were doing so because it was not really violating the Establishment Clause, because it was wholly separate. It was a generalized treatment of all students, secular and private, and the religious schools. So there was nothing religious about it. But it wasn't really the case with Justice Black was that he really had a dark world view about religion. He seemed to be very antagonistic to religious history at all. That it was full of wars and killing, and there's nothing good about religion in history. Of course, it's all wars and killing. Well, anyway, there was a case, Zorach versus Clausen, and this follows accommodationism, where Justice Stewart writes this because he recognizes that these justices are being quite anti-religious in their approach to the Establishment Clause and First Amendment. He says right here, he says, to restrict all religious exercises in the public school and public square, quote, he says, is not seen as a realization of state neutrality, there's that principle, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or at least as government support of beliefs of those who think that religious exercises should be conducted only in private. So again, he's pointing out that if neutrality is a principle, it cuts both ways, and it seems that it really tips in the favor of secularism rather than just staying out of the business of religion altogether. This upheld the Zorach First Clause and upheld the granting of students release time for public schools to attend religious education and services. We're going to find out later that is gotten rid of, and they're finding that the public schools time is the public schools time, and you're not going to get out of that for your religious beliefs. Finally, here we get to the meat of today's discussion, which is the Lemon Test. Now, the Lemon Test is a test for neutrality, and it comes from Lemon v. Kurtzman versus Kurtzman in 1971. And this is the case that established the Lemon Test, of course. And there are three main evils, according to this test, that they want to avoid. One is sponsorship, the other is financial support, and third is active involvement by the government in religious activities. So the case itself centered around two areas in Pennsylvania, one in Rhode Island, where they were reimbursing teachers for supplies that they bought themselves, and the schools could do this whether they be public or private, and so the governments would give teachers a reimbursement of the money that they spent for things they bought for their class. And turns out that in Pennsylvania and in Rhode Island, they're giving it to the schools, which will then reimburse the teachers. And somebody brings suit to it, and the claim is, we are paying taxpayer money for these religious schools to be, funded. And so I am actually paying my taxes towards religion. Now, if you remember early on in the class, we talked about how the states would take taxes and, for tithes, and they would tithe through the taxation system, and that just seemed wrong. So if you're a Baptist and, let's say you're in an area where the Congregationalists are, and they're taking a tax out, and you're getting 10% of your income going to a church that you don't belong to. That's kind of the argument here. It's just kind of, but the problem is, the question is it going to a church? And they're saying, yes, it is, because the schools are so integrated, their faith is so integrated in their learning, that even if you're a math teacher, and even if you're a history teacher, or a PE teacher, your faith is so that there were nuns everywhere, they were saying, and crosses everywhere. So essentially what we're doing is we're indirectly funding this religion, even though it's through the guise of reimbursement for supplies and the like. And so what had happened is in determining the outcome of this case, they used the three evils to avoid, which was 1, sponsorship, 2, financial support, as you see, and 3, active involvement. Now, with the financial support, it's pretty obvious if they're giving money, that's where they're going to make the claim, you're taking my taxpayer money and it is going to these guys who are religious. That ought not be the case. Now, I'm going to disagree with that, okay? Second, the sponsorship, they can make a claim that if the government is putting money or actively reimbursing them, that's sponsoring it, but they were doing that with all the other schools, so I don't think that's going to be the case. But finally, the active involvement comes where they say, if we were to give this money and if we were to involve ourselves with making sure that that money was strictly going to only secular topics and being taught in strictly a secular manner, if we did that, that would constitute too much involvement with the church, and thus it would violate this evil, or partake in the practice of evil, of active involvement in church affairs. So from this, Justice Berger says, he was Chief Justice at the time, we will not tolerate either governmentally established religion or governmental interference with religion. So he believes somehow this is an establishment of religion, or even to do so they would have to interfere. But from this we get the Lemon test. Now from this we get the Lemon test. And there's 3 prongs to the Lemon test. You ever get into grad school and you're taking another class on this somehow, they will ask, hey, do you know the Lemon test? And if any of you ever go to law school, they'll ask, do you know the Lemon test? Perhaps. I don't know if, it just depends on the class you'll be taking, whatever it's specialized in. But there are 3 prongs to the Lemon test. And the 3 prongs go something like this. Laws must have a secular purpose. That is, they cannot have a purpose, a direct purpose, that is, of advancing religion, that it can't have anything to do with church. So making a speed law, like, speed limit law, that's secular. I mean, it has nothing to do with religion. There's nowhere in the Bible it says, Jesus said, thou shalt, go 35 miles an hour on thy, streets with houses on both sides. No, not like that. So that's something like that. 2, they must have a primary effect here, not a secondary effect, but a primary effect that says that neither advances nor inhibits religion. Now, a secondary effect might actually inhibit religion in some ways. So, for example, if you're in the military and they have, the Uniform Code of Military Justice says you can't wear a beard. Well, the primary goal of this is not to inhibit the Muslims' religion. The primary goal is to create, 1, uniformity of the military, and 2, the ability to seal gas masks. It's much easier in combat to do that without a beard. The secondary effect, might inhibit his religion as to the requirement of growing a beard, and that becomes problematic. But the law's primary goal was not to do that. And 3, it must not foster excessive entanglement between church and state, and that's the third one, and it's entanglement. And so with the Lemon test, the Lemon court determined that these schools should not get the money because it did foster excessive entanglement. And they also believed that it did have the primary effect of advancing religion, because the school was so integrated religiously with all its subjects that they believed that any money going to it could advance the Catholic religion in that regard. Finally, something needs to be said about the case that was brought, because in the last video we talked about what it takes to bring a case, and bringing a case, one must have standing, and that there must be some kind of injury involved. So the person somehow must have suffered something real, right? And so in this case, what ended up happening is the claim was that the taxpayers, it was brought, this guy said, I'm paying my taxes. Well, that's interesting because the court ended up softening its position on what it takes to bring a case based on the fact that it was religious. So for example, if I said, "Well, I don't want to bring, pay my taxes towards, the advancement of abortive rights. I don't want any of my money going to Planned Parenthood," which I don't. Um, and I'm going to sue on behalf of that. They would say, "Well, yeah, you don't have standing because of that." Now, in the case of the establishment, they actually softened it and said in cases of establishment uh, cases, they can do that. So that was an interesting thing to know. Now, I might put up a reading on that. That's just a quote from a justice who was dissenting in the Lemon case. So I'll put that up for you to read. Anyway, with that, know this stuff because you will be asked to answer certain questions on it. I'm also going to put up the syllabus and the case of Lemon v. Kurtzman for you to go through so that I could ask you questions on that. Anyway, good luck. I'll see you soon.